Welcome again to the STAR training series, and today's topic, how to review a no-rise certification. Your presenter is Farron Affleck, and also on the line answering questions is Monica Urisco. Take it away, Farron.
Okay, thank you very much, Becca. I'm Farron Affleck. I'm a project manager and engineer for Atkins and STAR, and I've been doing floodplain modeling and mapping for 10 years or more. Today, I'd like to talk about what is a no-rise certification. We'll talk a little bit about the submittal requirements. We'll review a no-rise example, and then we'll take some questions. I don't plan to get extremely technical. The intent of this training is to be more for the community representative who might be tasked with receiving and reviewing no-rise certifications. I'm not going to get into depth on like how to perform a floodway analysis or things like that. Okay, so what is a no-rise certification? Okay. First, I want to cover a couple of definitions. Okay, so first we need to understand what is development, by FEMA standards by FEMA standards. So development is any man-made change. Okay, so it's not just the construction of new buildings. It could be building a fence. It could be storage of a lot of stuff. It could be dredging. So anything, really anything that we do as people to the river or the area around the river would be considered development. Okay, so then we can talk about what is a floodway? Okay, we got to understand this. This is a key component of discussing a no-rise certification. So a floodway is more or less it's the area that's reserved to discharge the base flood without causing an increase in the water surface elevation. And usually that increase is designated as 1 foot. Okay. I'm not going to read the definition there, but that's essentially what it is. It's the area that we don't want to disturb to avoid increasing the water surface more than 1 foot. Okay, so I've got a little cartoon here that kind of walks through, how a floodway is, what I mean by that, and then kind of how a floodway is also determined. So you would start with the 100-year or base flood condition, and then you would assume that there's some kind of development on the fringes of the floodplain, okay? And then that development would cause a change in the water surface elevation. As you pinch off as you develop in the fringes, the water can't be out on the edges, so it kind of has to be concentrated in the middle, and the water surface goes up. Okay, and then so a floodway is defined when that encroachment causes a surcharge of a certain amount, and usually, like I said, that surcharge, that number is 1.0 feet. Okay, so for our purposes here, we're talking about encroachment into a point where the surcharge causes 1 foot. At that limit, that's what you call the floodway. Okay. Okay, so this is FEMA's requirements they're standard as it pertains to the floodway, and you can read all of that language, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of things here. A floodway, we have to prohibit encroachment within the adopted regulatory floodway unless it will not result in an increase in flood levels. Okay, so basically we can't allow any development in the floodway unless we can show that it will not cause an increase in flood levels. So the picture before, we can allow development in the flood fringe, and it can increase the water surface elevation up to 1 foot, but within the floodway, we can't allow any increase in flood levels. Okay, so what does it mean to the floodplain administrator? Okay, so before issuing any development permits in the floodway, you need to stop, okay? You need to get an analysis and a certification stating that the development will cause no increase in flood levels, and then once you have that, you can move on. Okay, so what do I mean by certification? Okay, so the certification is what we commonly refer to as a no-rise. So a lot of people say you need to get a no-rise. What that actually means is you need to get a certification that states that development will cause no increase in the flood levels. Okay, but the common terminology is a no-rise certification. Okay, so what is a no-rise certification, right? So it's an engineering analysis that proves that there will be no impact to the base flood elevation, floodway, or floodway elevations or floodway widths. It has to be certified by a professional engineer. It needs to be done before you issue permits, and the community needs to keep this certification and the documentation that supports it on file. So it's not submitted to the no-rise certification is not submitted to FEMA. It's submitted to it's submitted to the community, and then the community holds it and keeps it in their files in case FEMA comes to perform an audit, or if they might have a CAV where they ask, well, are you keeping track of your no-rise certifications? And you say yes, and they might ask, well, can I just see, that you have those, and then you can provide them. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about what we have to do to prove if there is an impact. Okay, so that proof has to be supported by technical data. And so what do I mean by technical data? It needs to be based on the effective model, and it needs to be, you would take the effective model and modify it to represent the pre and post project conditions, and then from that you would compare the pre and post project models and show that there's no increase between the two. Okay, so you start with the effective model, but the comparison is actually between the pre or existing conditions and the post or developed conditions models, and you show there's no increase between those two models, and then it's considered a no-rise. If the effective model is unavailable, or if you can justify that the effective model is inappropriate for the situation, then you can use an alternative model, and I'll talk a little bit more about an example of that later. But basically, you can use an alternative model if the effective is unavailable or inappropriate. However, the alternative model would need to be calibrated to match the effective FIS profile within half a foot, and the alternative model has to be FEMA approved. Okay, so not all projects are a no-rise. Okay, so remember, no-rise is just a term, right? You can't just create a no-rise. You have to do an analysis that proves that there is no rise. So a rise is considered any increase in the base flood elevation, or in the water surface elevations that is more than 0.00 feet. So that's how many digits, 0.00 feet. Okay. A cumulative, cumulative impacts can occur. So even if you have proof that there's no rise in the model for each individual situation, it's possible that as you add up all the little changes in the river or stream as a whole, there could be rise. Okay, so you might show insignificant rises on individual cases, but overall, they actually might cause a rise when you put them all together. So as a floodplain administrator, you need to think about that. You can't just look at every submission as independent of everything else around it. And then so in reality, yeah, development can cause rise even if the models aren't showing the rise. And then if you have a project that has a rise, all right, they do the floodway analysis and they determine that there is a rise caused by this project. It's not the end of the world. They can pursue a CLOMAR, a conditional letter of map revision, and it's possible to get that approved with FEMA depending on who you're impacting and where those rises are occurring. It's possible to get that approved by FEMA. It's just a little bit longer process. So the way you need to think of it is the no-rise application allows for kind of a faster track for development, but it's a harder proof. The CLOMAR application is a little bit longer process, but it's a little bit it allows for a little bit it allows for some changes or impacts on the floodplain and water surface elevations. And so really, when you think about it, a true no-rise, again, getting back to the model, and the model might say 0.00 feet, or something, but a true no-rise situation cannot exist without some form of mitigation. You can't just put a bunch of stuff in the floodplain and say, well, the model didn't say it rose, so it must be okay. Okay, so let me get into that a little bit more here. What I mean by mitigation is, in this example, you have the diagonal hatching on the right shows there's some existing building or something, and they're proposing some new development in the floodway. Well, that development's that fill or encroachment is going to be taking away capacity from the river. Okay, so if you're going to remove some capacity, if you're going to fill in some of the river, then you would either need to excavate somewhere else and remove and kind of have a cut and fill balance to keep that capacity open, or you would have to do something to change the land cover in the river. Okay, so if it's all grass and vegetation, if it became concrete lined, that would be a change in the land cover or a change in the roughness of the river. Okay, a key there is you have to show that that change, that mitigation action, is actually a permanent action. You can't just say, we're going to go cut all the weeds down and mow them all down, and then it's fixed, because they'll grow right back, right? So it has to be permanent. Okay, and I have a little bubble there. Conveyance is the capacity of the system to carry flow. This capacity is based on a combination of area and surface roughness. So those are kind of the two things that you would focus on if you're looking for some sort of mitigation. Okay, then another thing I want to talk about is a hydraulic shadow. Okay, so this is a situation where you might have an existing structure or thing already in the floodway. I guess it could be a structure, or it could be, some feature, an island sticking up or something like that. So you already have something in the way of the water, and it has to move around this thing. So in theory, you can build in the hydraulic shadow. So in this image, I show kind of this expansion and contraction zone, these triangles, and that's the theory, is that the water has to split to go around, and then it has to converge afterwards. And so that split is not immediate. It kind of has to start upstream a little bit, and it makes that triangle. And then the convergence back kind of takes a little while for it to converge back. So the idea is this area in the triangle might be wet, there might be water there, but it's not actually moving anywhere. And so in theory, you could build something in that triangle or in that hydraulic shadow, and it wouldn't cause an increase in the water surface elevation. That's the theory, but really, people have gotten in trouble with that, where they just kind of make that assumption. But then when you model it, the assumption was wrong. So the best thing to do is back that up with revisions to the model. but that is an idea of where you could do something without causing a negative impact. Okay, and then I also wanted to point out that there are some exceptions. Sometimes there are exceptions in allowing development in the floodway that might cause some increase, but really they are rare. Okay, so in Region 10, they have an exception for fish enhancement structures. Okay, but they still require the analysis. You know, they have to make sure there's no habitable structure that's being impacted, and it's still up to the community to be okay with it. Okay, so for example, they do allow some exception, but not completely. Like Region 10 says, okay, we allow these fish enhancement structures, but the biggest exception they've seen is, you know, 0.1, 0.2 feet rise in these uninhabited areas. So it's not like it's a big exception, really. They still have to do all the analysis. They still have to show kind of a minimal impact, and the community needs to be okay and accepting of the risk, and then they have to communicate that to the region before it would be approved. This is just one example. In other regions, there might be others. I'm not aware of all of them, but I just wanted to make this point. Pop quiz: an increase of 0.006 is considered a no rise. True or false? So the correct answer is false. And it's kind of a tricky question, but when you round 0.006, when you round it up to the next digit, it rounds up to a 0.01, which would be considered a rise. If it was 0.004 or something, it would round down. So if a no rise cannot be achieved, oh, I have a spelling error there. If a no rise cannot be achieved, then there are no other options for development. True or false? Okay, so the correct answer for this is false. So there are other options. Like I said, you can submit a conditional letter of map revision, otherwise known as a CLOMAR. It doesn't mean the CLOMAR will be approved, but that is another option, and the CLOMAR might be able to, you might be able to show that there's no impacts on anything important like a habited structure, and maybe FEMA would be okay with it. The point is the no-rise application is kind of the fast route, but it's a little more strict. The CLOMAR application is a little bit more intensive, but allows for a little bit more flexibility. Okay. So there are always options available to you. Okay, so let's talk about submittal requirements. The models. First, you need to start with an effective model. And what do I mean by effective model? It seems like that would be an easy thing to say, yeah, start with the effective model. There are actually 3 possible models that are considered the effective model. So the first one would be the current effective model. This is the model that you would find in the FEMA library. Okay, so the current effective model is exactly what you ask. When you ask FEMA, I need your effective model, and whatever they send you, that is the effective model. Also, I want to point out, watch out for letters of map revision, or LOMARs. Be sure that you're not missing those when you request an effective model. Okay, so you asked FEMA for a model and you got something back. Okay, that doesn't mean that it's a model. It could be just a scanned copy of something. It could be just about anything. So, well, not just anything, but it could be a model or a scanned copy or a data file, but you need to run it yourself, kind of thing. So the next effective model is the duplicate effective model, and so this is the electronic version that has all the parameters that match FEMA's current effective model exactly. So if you got a scanned copy of a model with their model inputs. You take those inputs, you put it into the computer software and run it. That's a duplicate effective model. It duplicates the results that FEMA got or had, but it's in a digital format. Let's see if so. A point I can make there is if there is no model available, this is where you might create a theoretical duplicate model where it's calibrated to match FEMA's profile or water surface profile. So you produce them, you end up with a model that runs and has the same results that FEMA has. Okay, so then sometimes, not all of the time, but sometimes it's necessary to correct FEMA's model. So these corrections would need to represent conditions at the time that the effective model was built. This is important to know. The corrected effective model is not the existing conditions model. Okay, if the model was built in 1995, you would need to, any corrections you make to the model would need to represent conditions from 1995. Okay, it might include the addition of cross sections or incorporation of topography or something like that. The key is just make sure that the corrected effective model, or even corrections might include errors from the duplicate model. Okay, so if they had something incorrect in the geometry on some bridge, you could fix it, but it would just have to represent conditions from the effective time. So the key is no man-made physical changes since the effective model. Okay, so I'm going to show some pictures of what I'm talking about. So you call up FEMA or you submit a library request and they give you a scanned copy of a HEC2 model, and this is considered the current effective model. HEC2 is not supported anymore, so you have to create a duplicate model using a similar program, HEC-RAS. So you take all the information out of HEC2 and plug it into HEC-RAS and get it running. And then after that, you can correct any errors and add detail to that HEC-RAS, and that would be considered the corrected effective model. I'm talking a lot about this. I don't intend that this is like a stressful thing to think about. I just want to make the point there are actually more than one version of the effective model, and in the end, you need to get to the point where you have that corrected version or the duplicate version so that you can move to the next step. They all have to be based on the current model. Okay, so you get your effective model fixed up and ready to work with, and at that point, you start adding in any existing conditions changes that might have occurred since the effective model. So you haven't built anything yet, but you notice the effective model didn't have something that you can see plainly on the ground now. So that's when you add in things that you can see now. So you develop this model that represents existing conditions, and it's based off of the duplicate or corrected effective model. Let's see. Yep, and then from there, so that's your existing conditions model. From there, you develop a proposed conditions model where you basically take that existing model and then you add your proposed development changes to that model and then run it. So you kind of end up with three versions. You have an effective model, an existing conditions model, and a proposed conditions model. Also in the application support, this is kind of a list of things that, I guess this isn't a complete list, but it's a list of a lot of things that should be submitted with the models. Okay, so I'll highlight a couple of things. You need a comparison of the effective, existing, and proposed results. You need to, anything else that you think you need that's not on this list. So as a reviewer, as a floodplain administrator, if they submit, all this documentation to you, and you still, if there's anything you feel like you're missing, you have the right to request that data as part of their submission. It's not. That's why I'm saying this is a list of things, but there's, if you think there's anything else that you need, then you're right. And then the last one I want to point out is just a quick, the Topo Map. This is kind of a key thing that you should be able to, that you can look at. I got to be honest, I don't love this Topo Map picture, but I think it gives the idea of what you need. There's terrain in the background. Probably better would have been like contours or something like that. But anyway, there's that black and gray terrain symbology in the background. It shows the floodplain and the floodway in red. It shows additional cross sections that were added in those light yellow. So those are kind of the new cross sections needed to evaluate this project, and it shows the site location and any proposed modifications. So you would want to see all that in your Topo Map. Okay, so here's a pop quiz, everybody. The corrected effective model includes existing development that has occurred since the time of the original effective model. The corrected effective model is supposed to represent conditions at the time the effective model was developed. So it might have some corrections to include extra cross sections or terrain or something like that, but it still needs to represent the conditions at the time of the effective. The existing conditions model is built to represent the conditions now, the conditions that you're in now. So I know it would be kind of hard to add a lot of things and so it's not like it's a normal problem to deal with. Usually the corrected effective model is just taking the effective model and fixing any model bugs that are in there and then working with that. But it's the existing conditions model that represents conditions today since the effective was developed. Hopefully I cleared that up. Okay, so we can talk a little bit about how to review the review steps for a no-rise certification. So first, you want to make sure they did actually submit a certification and that it's proper. You want to look at that map that I was talking to you about, the Topo Map. You want to read the entire report, and as an engineer, I just say, definitely read the whole report. Don't skip stuff. Sometimes the engineers will say a lot of things that are, seem like they're leading in one direction, and then at the end, there's something that kind of changed it all, and that's why they concluded the way they did. So read the whole report. You'll want to look at the effective information, so you got to download it and then compare that effective information, like the firm and the FIS information. You want to compare all that to what they modeled. If they provide it for you, that's okay. That helps. I guess that could be a request that you ask that they provide you that data. You'll want to note any errors or anything that they corrected that they needed to correct in the effective. And then you would need a summary table. You really need a summary table that compares the pre and post-project conditions. So I think I point this out in a little bit, but the no-rise is based on the comparison of existing or pre-project conditions with the post-project conditions. It's not a comparison of the effective to post-project. So when you're looking for no-rise, you're looking for a no-rise between the existing condition and post and developed condition. You're not looking at the effective condition and developed condition. So that 0.00 is between pre and post-project conditions. Yep, and then from that summary table, you should be able to compare the water surface elevations and floodway elevations and all those things. And that's the biggest thing you're looking for, is no change between existing and proposed conditions. Okay, so if you feel like you're watching my presentation, you're like, oh my gosh, there's so many things that I got to do. I don't, I'm not qualified for this, I'm not technical enough to do this review, and you're feeling overwhelmed, don't worry, there is help. So you can ask FEMA to help you out, and FEMA understands that not every community is able to have a floodplain administrator who is an expert in HEC-RAS and who is an expert in hydraulic modeling and those kinds of things. So if you need help, you can ask for help. They just ask that you submit the request in writing, and they ask that at a minimum that you verify that the package is complete. So that basically that checklist I showed you earlier, that you can at least verify that they did submit all of those things. And then FEMA can help you out with a technical review and help you understand if what they're certifying is okay. It would be kind of an unofficial response from FEMA. If you decide that you need, for whatever reason, if you decide that you need an official comment from FEMA that approves this plan, then you need to submit, they need to submit a conditional letter of map revision to FEMA, and then you would get official comments from FEMA and an official approval. So if the community really doesn't want that burden of signing off that the no-rise certification is okay as it was submitted, then you can have them submit a CLOMAR. Okay, so for example, we're going to walk through an example of a project here and kind of some high-level steps of how the review would take place. Okay, so this is an example of a pretty small project. They wanted to put a little trail with some landscaping in the floodway. Like I said, it's small. It's only 10 feet wide. So some of the elements include a concrete trail, retaining walls, and some landscaping. Okay, and it's obviously in the floodway. So first we want to start with looking at the effective condition. Okay, so the green lines represent the effective cross sections that are available in the area. So our site is right smack in the middle, and there's no cross sections in the effective model that would even cover the site. So they had to take the effective HEC2 model and convert it to HEC-RAS to create a duplicate effective model. And then they compared, because HEC-RAS is not HEC2, they had to make sure that the differences between the duplicate effective model and the effective HEC2 model are less than half a foot, and they were able to show that. In this case, there was a datum conversion, so I guess this is a side note. Keep an eye out for datum conversions. You don't want that to catch you. It doesn't actually change your base flood elevations or anything like that. It's just a base on what the site was surveyed at, or yeah. So they had to convert for that. The corrected effective conditions added a bunch of cross sections that covered the whole area. Okay, so they added they had the effective cross sections in green, and then they added a bunch of intermediate cross sections to represent conditions. The assumption was that the LiDAR terrain they have is unchanged, or the terrain is unchanged since the effective date and since the LiDAR terrain was flown, so they were able to use that. And that's tricky. I mean, you don't always have great terrain from back when it was effective, but you just need to maybe correct it or alter it a little bit if you know that there's been development since then. And then the floodway was set based on the effective firm locations. So where the cross sections cross the floodway that's where the floodway widths were set up. And then they are aware of a bridge that was added to the area since the effective. So I don't know how this got added, but it's there. So the effective conditions didn't have a bridge, and now there is a bridge. We can see it, it's on the ground, so we need to consider it as an existing condition situation. So they added the existing condition model includes that bridge. And it's possible that that bridge had a no-rise certification from some time back. So then from there, they can say, okay, we've built our existing conditions model. They started with their effective, they corrected it, they used that corrected model to build an existing conditions model, and now they're going to build on their existing conditions model to show the proposed condition. So this is where they would update their cross-sections and update their terrain and show the proposed elements that they want to incorporate into the model. So this is kind of a cross-section that shows in black the existing condition cross-sections, and then it shows the pink. There's pink, and it's all identical except for that little jog over there with the giant orange arrow pointing at it. That's the little change in terrain that represents the trail. And so a couple things to point out here are, one, the change is really quite small. You can see everything is almost identical, and they're submitting a pretty small change. That's if you're developing in the Floodway, I mean, just thinking about it from a floodplain administrator point of view, you shouldn't be doing major development in the Floodway anyway. That's not the point of, that's the point of the Floodway, is to prevent major changes and keep that area open. So they have a small change going in, and then what I also like about it is you can see the cut and fill kind of balances here. So just intuitively, you think, well, they're adding a little bit on the left, but they're cutting a little bit on the right, so maybe the area balances out, so maybe we're okay. And then something else to consider is that the change that they are adding is a concrete slab, which technically has a lower roughness on it, so they could have changed the Manning's End along the concrete part if they wanted to. They did not, but I guess they could have. And it wasn't even necessary anyway. I think the changes were small enough and the cut and fill balance was low enough that, or was good enough that they were able to achieve a no-rise condition. So when they compare the existing conditions and the proposed conditions, they see zeros or negatives in their change in water surface elevations for the 100-year and the floodway condition, which is great. That means that we didn't increase. There is no increase, so there is no rise. Remember, key is between existing and proposed condition. This is not a comparison of the effective and proposed condition. Okay, so pop quiz. The no-rise determination is made by comparing existing and proposed condition results, true or false. The comparison must be between the existing and proposed condition, so the answer is true. I keep making this point, I keep repeating it, but I want to, you need to understand it's the existing and proposed condition that has to show no rise. It's not the effective and proposed condition. It's good practice as a community or as a floodplain administrator to maintain a model. If you can do this, it's great. If you can maintain a model that represents all development in the stream, and so you're continually updating the same model, that's a great practice, okay? And what that'll show is if there are any minor or cumulative effects of just a lot of little tiny developments that start to cause increases, you would catch it that way instead of having a bunch of independent models that you're not really sure how they impact each other. So it's good practice to maintain. You would start with the correct, an effective model or a duplicate effective model. And then as people decide to develop, you say, here, use this model and show me no rise. And then they model it and give it back to you, and then you see there's no rise. And then when the next person comes along to develop, you give them that version of the model, the proposed version of the model, and say, okay, build on this and show me no rise. And so you would just continually update that same model. That would be a great practice to try to incorporate. So from here, I think I'll wrap it up. I'll summarize a couple of things. A no rise quote-unquote, no rise is a term commonly used to represent floodway analysis that shows no increase in flooding. So remember, the term no rise is we're just talking about an analysis that proves there's no increase. People just like to call it a no rise. If somebody submits what they call a no rise and it has a rise, it's not a no rise. Okay, so it's a floodway analysis, and if the floodway analysis shows no increase, then you say, yes, this is a no rise. Not all cases are no rise situations, and there are alternatives for that. So, yep, and I say that right here on the slide. No, not all projects are no rise. CLOMAR may be necessary. So a CLOMAR is an option that could be taken. Communities are responsible for reviewing and maintaining the documentation. So FEMA is not going to review your no-rise certifications, or they're not submitting the no-rise applications to FEMA. They're submitting them to the communities. The communities would perform the review and approval and maintain the documentation. If you need help, FEMA can help you with some of the review, but in the end, it's still on the community. There are some exemptions. For example, the fish structures in Region 10. Like I said, that's a pretty rare case. Even it's not like they allow significant impacts to the floodplain or floodway with those either. So there may be some exemptions. You can ask your regional representatives about that. And then the key, your no-rise application or certification needs to be certified by a professional engineer, and it needs to prove that there is no increase between the existing and proposed conditions, all based on the original effective modeling. So those are the keys that you need to look for. Those are kind of, I think that summarizes just about everything I had talked through. If you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to the Region 10 Help Desk. We can answer any questions you have about this presentation or floodways. Obviously, if you're not in Region 10, you can call us if you want. We'd be happy to help you out, or you can always go to your regional representatives also. Here's my contact information. Thank you, everybody, for your time. I really appreciate the opportunity to give this training. And again, if you would like to reach out to me, my information was there on the screen, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much.